Ruthless bikers threaten a lone soldier. What happens next leaves them begging for forgiveness. The sun was setting over the open highway, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. Captain Mark Travis gripped the steering wheel of his old truck, his eyes scanning the road ahead. The duffel bag on the passenger seat was the only indication of his life before this moment. It carried everything he had left from his military service. A few clothes, his medals, and the memories he couldn't leave behind. Mark had spent 12 years serving his country, earning distinction as a leader and strategist in the Special Forces. But now, with his honorable discharge finalized, he was trying to figure out what came next. The transition back to civilian life had been anything but smooth. He wasn't the same man who had left home all those years ago, and he wasn't sure where he belonged anymore. As his truck rolled into a small, dusty town, Mark's stomach reminded him he hadn't eaten all day. He pulled into the parking lot of a roadside diner, its neon sign flickering against the twilight sky. The diner looked like it had been pulled straight out of the 1950s, with chrome accents and a jukebox visible through the window. Mark grabbed his duffel bag, out of habit more than necessity, and slung it over his shoulder as he stepped out of the truck. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the diner. Inside, the smell of fried food and coffee greeted him, along with the low hum of conversation. He found a seat at the counter and set his bag down at his feet. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a tired smile, walked over with a notepad in hand. "What'll it be, hon?" she asked. "Just a coffee and a burger," Mark replied, his voice steady but quiet. She nodded, jotting down the order. "Coming right up." Mark's gaze drifted to the other patrons in the diner. Most were locals, an older couple sharing a milkshake, a group of teenagers laughing in a booth. But near the back, a group of leather-clad men stood out like wolves among sheep. Their heavy boots and black jackets bore patches that marked them as part of a biker gang. The largest of them, a man with a scar running down the side of his face, sat at the center of the group, his deep laugh cutting through the diner's quiet chatter. Mark recognized the type immediately. He'd encountered men like them before, men who thrived on intimidation and chaos. He kept his eyes on his coffee cup, determined to avoid drawing their attention. But fate, as always, had other plans. Victor Steele leaned back in his booth, his sharp eyes scanning the diner. He was the leader of the Iron Vultures, a gang that had carved out a reputation for lawlessness and fear across the region. Victor lived for control, and he could sense the power dynamics in any room with ease. Tonight, his attention landed on the quiet man sitting alone at the counter. "Hey, Steele," one of the younger bikers said, nodding toward Mark. "What do you think his story is?" Victor smirked, his fingers drumming against the table. "Let's find out." He rose from his seat, his boots thudding against the floor as he made his way to the counter. The other bikers watched with amusement, eager to see what kind of trouble their leader would stir up this time. Mark didn't look up as Victor approached, but he felt the man's presence beside him, a heavy weight in the air. Victor leaned against the counter, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Nice bag you got there," Victor said, his tone casual but laced with menace. "What's in it?" Mark took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. "Nothing you'd be interested in," he replied evenly. Victor chuckled, his scarred face twisting into a grin. "Oh, I don't know about that. You military?" Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Victor took that as confirmation. "Thought so. You've got that look about you, like you think you're better than everyone else." Mark finally turned his head, his gaze meeting Victor's. His eyes were calm, steady, but there was a hardness behind them, a warning that Victor either didn't notice or chose to ignore. "I'm just here to eat," Mark said. "I'm not looking for trouble." Victor laughed, loud and sharp. "Trouble? Who said anything about trouble?" He turned to the other bikers, gesturing dramatically. "You hear that, boys? He thinks I'm looking for trouble." The gang erupted in laughter, their voices filling the diner. Mark's fingers curled into a fist beneath the counter, but he forced himself to relax. He wasn't going to let them bait him. Not here. Not now. The waitress returned with Mark's burger, setting the plate down in front of him with a nervous glance at Victor. "Here you go, hon," she said softly. "Thanks," Mark replied, his tone polite despite the tension. Victor reached out and grabbed one of the fries from Mark's plate, popping it into his mouth. "Not bad," he said, chewing obnoxiously. "But I think I'll pass." Mark's patience was wearing thin. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that these men were just looking for a reaction. If he stayed calm, they'd get bored and move on. But Victor wasn't done. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "What's the matter, soldier boy? Too scared to fight back?" Mark set his burger down, his appetite gone. He stood up, his height putting him eye to eye with Victor. The room seemed to hold its breath as the two men stared each other down. "I told you," Mark said quietly. "I'm not looking for trouble. Now back off." For a moment, it seemed like Victor might listen. But then his smirk returned, and he reached for Mark's duffel bag. "What's in here, huh?" Victor said, tugging at the strap. "A diary? Love letters? Or something more interesting?" Mark's hand shot out, grabbing Victor's wrist with lightning speed. The sudden movement made the bikers flinch, and Victor's grin faltered for the first time. "Don't," Mark said, his voice cold and firm. "My bag." The room was dead silent. Even the other patrons, who had been trying to avoid the confrontation, were now watching with wide eyes. Victor's men shifted uneasily, waiting for their leader's response. Victor pulled his hand back, flexing his fingers as if to test Mark's grip. Then he laughed, the sound forced and brittle. "All right, soldier boy," he said, stepping back. "You've got guts. I'll give you that." Mark didn't respond. He picked up his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and dropped a few bills on the counter to cover his meal. As he walked toward the door, Victor called after him. "You can't run forever, soldier. This isn't over." Mark didn't look back. He pushed the door open and stepped into the cool night air, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew Victor meant every word, and he had a sinking feeling that this was far from the last time their paths would cross. Mark walked toward his truck, his boots crunching against the gravel in the silent parking lot. The faint hum of cicadas filled the air, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. His instincts, honed through years of combat, screamed at him to stay alert. He placed his bag carefully on the passenger seat and opened the driver's door, his eyes darting toward the reflection in the rearview mirror. In the distance, he spotted movement near the edge of the lot. Shadows flickered against the dim light of the diner's neon sign. The bikers. Mark knew they weren't going to let this go. He had seen it in Victor's eyes, a dangerous mix of pride and anger. They weren't just going to let him drive away. Mark sighed, gripping the steering wheel for a moment before letting go. He closed the door softly, the sound barely audible. Slowly, he stepped back from the truck, turning toward the darkness. His voice carried through the stillness, calm but firm. "If you're going to make a move, do it now." For a moment, there was silence. Then the shadows stirred, and Victor emerged, flanked by 4 of his men. The gang's laughter echoed through the lot as they spread out, surrounding Mark like predators circling their prey. "You've got guts, soldier," Victor said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But you don't seem too bright. Walking away would have been the smart move." Mark's eyes scanned the men around him, noting their positions and movements. His body remained still, but his mind was calculating. He wasn't afraid, he had faced far worse, but he didn't want to hurt anyone unless he had to. "I did walk away," Mark said evenly. "You followed me." Victor smirked, pulling a knife from his pocket and flipping it open. The blade glinted in the dim light. "That's because you didn't give me what I wanted. And now, you're going to pay for that." Mark's gaze flicked to the knife before returning to Victor's face. "This isn't a fight you want to start," he warned. "Walk away while you still can." Victor laughed, the sound cold and sharp. "You think I'm scared of you? I've seen your type before, big talk, but you crumble the second things get real." Mark's expression didn't change. "Last chance?" Victor lunged forward, the knife aimed for Mark's chest. But before the blade could make contact, Mark moved. His hand shot out with precision, grabbing Victor's wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground as Victor cried out in pain. In the same fluid motion, Mark spun him around, locking his arm behind his back. "Stand down," Mark said, his voice low and commanding. The other bikers hesitated, clearly shocked by how quickly their leader had been subdued. But Victor's pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. "What are you waiting for?" he snarled. "Take him." The first biker charged, swinging a chain toward Mark's head. Mark released Victor, ducking under the attack and countering with a swift elbow to the man's ribs. The biker stumbled back, clutching his side. Another one came at him with a tire iron, but Mark sidestepped the blow and grabbed the weapon, twisting it out of the man's hands. He used it to sweep the biker's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. The remaining two hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Mark stood his ground, his breathing steady, the tire iron held loosely in his hand. "Enough," he said, his tone final. "This doesn't have to go any further." But Victor wasn't done. He pushed himself to his feet, his face twisted with rage. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted. "You think you can just walk away?" Mark turned to face him, his expression calm but firm. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," he said. "But I know when to fight and when to stop. Do you?" Victor's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't move. For a moment, it seemed like he might attack again, but then one of the bikers spoke up. "Boss, maybe we should let this one go," the man said, his voice uneasy. "He's not worth it." Victor's glare shifted to his subordinate, but the man didn't back down. The others nodded in agreement, their confidence shaken by Mark's display of skill. "You're all cowards," Victor spat, but his voice lacked conviction. Slowly, he stepped back, his hands dropping to his sides. "This isn't over, soldier." Mark watched as the bikers retreated, their footsteps fading into the night. He stood there for a long moment, his muscles tense, before finally lowering the tire iron and tossing it to the ground. He climbed into his truck, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As he drove away, his mind raced with thoughts. He hadn't wanted the fight, but it had been unavoidable. Still, something about Victor's words lingered in his mind. This isn't over. The next morning, Mark stopped at a small motel to rest. As he sipped his coffee in the lobby, he caught sight of a news report on the television. The reporter spoke about a string of crimes attributed to the Iron Vultures, including theft, assault, and extortion. Mark's jaw tightened. He had hoped last night would be the end of it, but now he realized the gang was a much bigger problem than he had anticipated. He couldn't just ignore it. After finishing his coffee, Mark made a few phone calls. His military connections were still strong, and it didn't take long for him to gather information on the Iron Vultures. He learned that the gang operated out of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the next town, using it as their base of operations. Mark knew he couldn't take them all on by himself, but he also couldn't let them continue terrorizing the area. He decided to pay them a visit, not to fight, but to offer them a choice. He believed in second chances, even for people like Victor. But if they refused to change, he was prepared to do whatever it took to stop them. That evening, Mark parked his truck a safe distance from the warehouse and approached on foot. The building loomed in the darkness, its windows broken and its walls covered in graffiti. The sound of motorcycles echoed from inside, along with raucous laughter and music. Mark took a deep breath before stepping into the light. The laughter stopped as the bikers turned to face him, their expressions a mix of surprise and hostility. "You've got some nerve showing up here," Victor said, stepping forward. His face was still bruised from their previous encounter, but his eyes burned with defiance. "I'm not here to fight," Mark said, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. "I want to talk." The bikers exchanged uncertain glances, but Victor scoffed. "Talk? You think we're interested in what you have to say?" Mark's gaze swept over the group, his voice calm but firm. "You're better than this. All of you. I've seen what you're capable of, and it's not too late to change." The bikers shifted uncomfortably, their bravado faltering. Victor's face twisted in anger. "Don't listen to him. He doesn't know anything about us." "I know more than you think," Mark said, his eyes locking onto Victor's. "I know what it's like to feel lost, to think the world owes you something. But this isn't the way to fix it. You're only making things worse for yourselves and everyone around you." Victor's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't interrupt. Mark took a step closer, his voice softening. "You have a choice. Keep going down this path and lose everything, or turn things around and make something of yourselves. I can help you. But you have to want it." The room fell silent. The bikers looked at Victor, waiting for his response. For a long moment, he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Finally, he turned away, his shoulders slumping. "Get out," he muttered. "Just get out." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "The offer stands. If you change your mind, you know where to find me." As he walked out of the warehouse, Mark felt a flicker of hope. He had planted the seed. Now it was up to them to decide what to do with it. Mark left the warehouse with mixed feelings. He had offered them a chance, a way out, but he couldn't be sure if they would take it. As he climbed back into his truck and drove away, the faces of the bikers lingered in his mind. He saw hesitation in their eyes, a crack in their hardened facades. Yet Victor's pride and anger remained a looming obstacle. Change wouldn't come easily for him or his gang. The next morning, Mark stopped at a small diner a few towns over. He needed time to reflect and figure out his next steps. He ordered a black coffee and settled into a booth near the window, staring out at the passing cars. His thoughts drifted back to his days in the military, where discipline and camaraderie had been the foundation of his life. He wondered if he could instill those same values in a group of men who had spent years living outside the law. His musings were interrupted when a man approached his table. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a quiet, commanding presence. His sharp eyes gave away his years of experience, though he wore plain clothes that suggested he was trying to blend in. "Mark Travis?" the man asked, his tone firm but not unfriendly. Mark nodded cautiously. "Who's asking?" The man extended a hand. "Special Agent Carter. I work with a federal task force targeting organized crime. Mind if I sit?" Mark gestured to the seat across from him. "Go ahead." Carter slid into the booth, folding his hands on the table. "We've been keeping tabs on the Iron Vultures for a while now. They've been involved in everything from drug trafficking to armed robbery. But recently, they've been quiet. No major activity in weeks. Any idea why that might be?" Mark took a sip of his coffee, choosing his words carefully. "I had a run-in with them a few nights ago. Let's just say they know I'm not someone they want to mess with." Carter raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "You've got their attention. That's no small feat." Victor Steele doesn't back down easily. "Neither do I," Mark replied, his tone even. Carter leaned forward, his expression serious. "If you've made an impression on them, we could use your help. We're building a case against the gang, but we need more intel. Someone they trust, or at least someone they fear, might be able to get us what we need." Mark shook his head. "I'm not an informant. That's not who I am." "I'm not asking you to be," Carter said. "I'm asking you to do what you're already doing. Talk to them. Push them in the right direction. If we can get them to cooperate, we might be able to take down the bigger players who are pulling the strings." Mark considered the agent's words. He had no love for law enforcement bureaucracy, but he couldn't deny the logic in Carter's proposal. If he could help dismantle the larger network of crime, it would be a win for everyone. "I'll think about it," Mark said finally. Carter nodded, sliding a business card across the table. "Call me if you change your mind." That night, Mark sat in his motel room, staring at the card on the bedside table. He thought about the bikers, especially Victor. Could they really change, or was he wasting his time? He wanted to believe in redemption. He had seen it happen before. But he also knew that not everyone was willing to take the harder path. The next day, Mark made a decision. He drove back to the warehouse, arriving just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sound of motorcycles rumbled in the distance, growing louder as he approached. When he stepped inside, he found the gang gathered around a table, their voices low and tense. Victor looked up, his expression darkening as he saw Mark. "You've got a death wish, soldier." Mark raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to talk." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, but Victor's glare didn't soften. "We don't want to hear it." Mark stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "You're running out of options, Victor. The feds are watching you. It's only a matter of time before they shut this place down. If you don't make a change now, you'll drag your men down with you." Victor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. And what do you expect us to do? Walk away? Get 9-to-5 jobs flipping burgers? That's not who we are. It's who you could be, Mark countered. You're a leader, Victor. These men follow you because they believe in you. Imagine what you could accomplish if you used that influence for something good. Victor's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. You don't know anything about us. I know enough, Mark said, his gaze steady. I know you're angry. I know you feel like the world turned its back on you. But taking it out on innocent people won't fix that. It'll only make things worse. The room was silent. The bikers watched their leader, waiting for his response. Finally, Victor sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping. And what do you suggest? He muttered. Mark took a step closer, sensing a crack in Victor's armor. I can help you. I've got connections, people who can get you job training, resources, a way out. But you have to want it. No more crime. No more violence. You turn yourselves around, or you'll end up behind bars, or worse. Victor stared at the table, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he nodded slowly. All right, he said. We'll give it a shot. Over the next few weeks, Mark worked tirelessly to help the gang transition into a new way of life. He connected them with programs that offered job training and education, and he helped them repair the warehouse, turning it into a community center where they could mentor at-risk youth. It wasn't easy. Some of the bikers struggled to adapt, and there were moments when Victor's temper threatened to derail their progress. But Mark remained steadfast, guiding them with patience and determination. One afternoon, as Mark helped repair a broken window in the warehouse, Victor approached him. He looked different, less guarded, more human. I owe you an apology, Victor said, his voice low. For everything. Mark straightened, meeting his gaze. You don't owe me anything. Just keep moving forward. Victor nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You're not what I expected, you know. When we first met, I thought you were just another guy trying to act tough. But you've got real strength. The kind I've never seen before. Mark smiled faintly. It's not about being tough. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. Months later, the warehouse was unrecognizable. The once derelict building had been transformed into a hub of activity, with classrooms, a workshop, and a small gym. The bikers, now mentors, taught skills like mechanics and carpentry to local teenagers, helping them find purpose and avoid the mistakes they had made. At the grand opening of the center, Mark stood beside Victor, watching as families and community members poured in. The sound of laughter and hope filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had once defined the space. You did it, Mark said, clapping Victor on the shoulder. We did it, Victor replied, his voice filled with gratitude. I couldn't have done this without you. Mark smiled, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he saw the impact of his actions ripple out into the world, creating something truly meaningful. As the sun set over the warehouse, Mark knew that his journey with the bikers was only the beginning. Together, they had proven that even the most broken people could find redemption, and that change was always possible, no matter how unlikely it seemed. The transformation of the Iron Vultures into a positive force for the community wasn't an overnight success. The gang's reputation as a group of criminals lingered like a dark cloud, and there were plenty of skeptics who doubted their sincerity. Some members of the community refused to set foot near the warehouse, convinced it was just a cover for more illegal activity. Others actively protested, claiming the bikers didn't deserve a second chance. Mark stood by the gang through the worst of it. He knew change wasn't easy, and it wasn't always welcomed. He had seen the same skepticism during his military deployments, in regions where trust in outsiders had eroded over decades. But he also knew that persistence, honesty, and hard work could change minds. One day, as Mark was helping repair a fence around the warehouse, a young boy approached the gate. He couldn't have been older than 12, with messy hair and a backpack that looked like it had seen better days. He hesitated at the entrance, clutching the straps of his backpack nervously. Mark smiled, setting down his tools. Hey there, he called out gently. You looking for something? The boy glanced around, his eyes darting toward Victor, who was unloading supplies nearby. Is it true? The boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Is what true? Mark asked, walking over. That they don't hurt people anymore, the boy said, his gaze fixed on Victor. My dad says they're just pretending. Mark knelt to the boy's level, his voice calm and reassuring. What's your name? Jake, the boy replied. Well, Jake, I can't speak for what they used to be, Mark said. But I can tell you what they are now. They're trying to do better. To help people instead of hurt them. That's why we built this place. Jake looked skeptical but curious. Really? Really, Mark said with a nod. Why don't you come inside and see for yourself? I'll show you around. Jake hesitated, glancing back toward the street where his bike was parked. Then, with a small nod, he followed Mark into the warehouse. Victor noticed them and walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. Who's this? Victor asked, his tone neutral but not unkind. This is Jake, Mark said. He wanted to see what we're doing here. Victor studied the boy for a moment before crouching down to meet his gaze. Nice to meet you, Jake, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. What do you want to know? Jake shifted nervously. My dad says you're dangerous. That I shouldn't come here. Victor sighed, a flicker of regret crossing his face. Your dad's not wrong, he admitted. We used to be dangerous. We did a lot of bad things. But we're trying to change that now. We're trying to make things right. Jake tilted his head, his curiosity outweighing his fear. Why? Victor glanced at Mark, then back at Jake. Because someone gave us a chance. And we don't want to waste it. Jake's visit marked a turning point. Word spread that the Iron Vultures had opened their doors to the community, and slowly, people began to trickle in. Parents brought their kids to learn woodworking and mechanics. Local teenagers signed up for boxing classes in the newly refurbished gym. Even the skeptics started to come around as they saw the positive impact the gang was having. One evening, Mark and Victor sat on the steps of the warehouse, watching the sun set over the town. The laughter of children echoed from inside, mingling with the sound of tools and the hum of conversation. You've done good here, Mark said, his voice quiet but sincere. Victor shook his head. We've done good. None of this would have happened without you. Mark smiled faintly. It's not about me. It's about all of you. You made the choice to change. I just gave you the nudge. Victor chuckled, lighting a cigarette. A nudge, huh? Felt more like a kick in the ass. They both laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded. For the first time in a long time, Victor felt like he had found something worth fighting for, something that didn't involve fists or weapons. But not everyone was ready to forgive. Late one night, as Mark was leaving the warehouse, he noticed a group of men lingering across the street. They weren't part of the gang, and their demeanor was tense and hostile. One of them stepped forward, his face partially obscured by the shadows. You think you can waltz into our town and fix everything? The man said, his voice dripping with disdain. You think a bunch of criminals can just wipe the slate clean? Mark stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing. I think everyone deserves a chance to do better, he said calmly. That's all we're trying to do here. The man scoffed, his friends murmuring behind him. You don't get it, do you? People like them don't change. They just find new ways to take advantage. Mark took a step closer, his voice steady but firm. You're angry. I get it. But they're not the same people they used to be. They're trying to give back, to make amends. Don't stand in the way of that. The man glared at him, his fists clenching. For a moment, it seemed like the situation might escalate. But then one of the man's friends put a hand on his shoulder, muttering something under his breath. With a reluctant nod, the group backed off, disappearing into the night. Mark watched them go, his chest tight with frustration. He knew changing the gang's reputation would take time, but he hadn't anticipated just how deep the resentment ran. The incident weighed on Mark as the weeks went by. He spent long hours at the warehouse, mentoring the gang members and helping them navigate their new roles. He could see the progress they were making, but he also saw the strain it put on them. Some days were harder than others, and there were moments when old habits threatened to resurface. One night, Victor called a meeting with the gang. They sat in a circle in the middle of the warehouse, the air heavy with tension. We've come a long way, Victor said, his voice steady but tired. But we've still got a lot to prove. To ourselves, to this town, and to everyone who's counting on us. The bikers nodded, their expressions a mix of determination and doubt. "I know it's not easy," Victor continued, "but we've got each other. And we've got Mark." He glanced at Mark, who stood quietly at the edge of the circle. "He's shown us what it means to fight for something real. Let's not let him down." The gang murmured in agreement, their resolve strengthening. Mark stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the group. "You've got this," he said simply. "One day at a time." Months turned into a year, and the warehouse became a cornerstone of the community. The bikers, once feared and despised, were now respected mentors and role models. They organized fundraisers, hosted charity events, and even partnered with local law enforcement to create outreach programs for at-risk youth. Mark, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. His work with the gang reminded him of the camaraderie he had once known in the military, and he felt a sense of pride in their accomplishments. He knew the journey wasn't over, but he also knew they were on the right path. One evening, as the gang celebrated the anniversary of the warehouse's opening, Victor raised a glass, his voice booming with gratitude. "To second chances," he said, his eyes meeting Mark's. "And to the man who showed us we were worth it." The room erupted into cheers, and Mark felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. He smiled, lifting his own glass. "To the future," he said. And for the first time, it truly felt like they had won. The Iron Vultures had come a long way, but for many in the town, scars left by the gang's past crimes still ran deep. No matter how many workshops they held or how much good they did, there were always murmurs of doubt. Rumors spread about how the gang was biding their time or fooling everyone before returning to their old ways. One afternoon, as Victor and Mark were overseeing the construction of a new community garden near the warehouse, a group of townspeople approached. They were led by an older man, Mr. Peterson, who had owned a nearby hardware store for decades. He stopped a few feet away, his arms crossed and his expression cold. "We need to talk," Peterson said, his voice firm. Mark wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped forward. "What can we do for you, Mr. Peterson?" Peterson ignored him, his sharp eyes fixed on Victor. "What gives you the right to be here, huh? You think planting flowers is going to make us forget what you did? My nephew still hasn't recovered from the beating your men gave him 2 years ago." The bikers working nearby fell silent, their gazes dropping to the ground. Victor's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "I can't undo what happened," Victor said, his voice low. "I wish I could, but I can't. All I can do now is try to make things right." Peterson scoffed. "Make things right? You think building gardens and fixing fences will fix the damage you've done? My nephew doesn't even leave the house anymore because of you." Mark stepped in, his voice calm but firm. "I understand your anger, Mr. Peterson. And you're right, it's not enough. But they're trying. They've changed. Isn't it better for them to spend their energy helping the community instead of hurting it?" Peterson's glare didn't soften. "Talk is cheap, soldier. Let's see how much they've really changed when the money runs out or the work gets hard. You'll see, they'll go right back to being what they are." The words stung, but Mark refused to let them shake him. "I guess we'll have to prove you wrong." Peterson muttered something under his breath before turning and walking away, the rest of the townspeople trailing behind him. The bikers stood in awkward silence, the weight of the encounter hanging heavy in the air. Victor let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. "No matter what we do, it's never going to be enough for some people." "Maybe not," Mark said. "But that doesn't mean we stop trying." The tension with the townspeople continued to simmer in the weeks that followed. Small acts of vandalism began to occur around the warehouse. Broken windows, graffiti sprayed on the walls, even slashed tires on the gang's motorcycles. Victor's men were furious, demanding that they fight back, but Victor held firm. "No," he said, his voice sharp. "We're not going down that road again. Let them do what they want. We'll fix it and keep moving forward." The gang grumbled but obeyed. Mark was impressed by Victor's restraint. It was a stark contrast to the man he had first met. Still, the constant setbacks took a toll on morale. Mark knew they needed a way to win over the town, to show everyone that the Iron Vultures were truly committed to change. The opportunity came when a powerful storm swept through the area, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Roads were flooded, power lines were down, and several homes had been damaged. The local emergency services were overwhelmed, struggling to respond to calls for help. Mark and Victor wasted no time rallying the gang. They loaded up their trucks with tools, supplies, and first aid kits, ready to assist wherever they were needed. The bikers worked tirelessly alongside other volunteers, clearing debris, repairing roofs, and delivering food and water to those in need. At first, the townspeople were wary of their help. Some refused to let them onto their property, still distrustful of their intentions. But as the days went on, the gang's actions began to speak louder than words. They worked without complaint, often going above and beyond to ensure everyone was safe and cared for. One evening, as Mark and Victor were helping clear a fallen tree from the road, Mr. Peterson approached. His face was lined with exhaustion, and his usual stern expression had softened. "I heard what you did for the Thompsons," Peterson said gruffly. "Their roof would have caved in if you hadn't patched it up." Victor set down his axe, wiping the sweat from his brow. "It's the least we could do." Peterson hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe I was wrong about you," he admitted. "It seems like you're really trying to make up for the past." "We are," Victor said simply. "But we've got a lot of work to do." Peterson extended a hand. "Well, if you keep this up, maybe the town will start to see that." Victor shook his hand, a flicker of hope lighting in his eyes. Mark watched the exchange, his chest swelling with pride. It was a small victory, but an important one. The storm recovery efforts became a turning point for the gang. As word spread about their dedication and hard work, more townspeople began to warm up to them. The vandalism stopped, and the community center saw a surge in visitors. Parents who had once forbidden their kids from going near the warehouse now brought them to the workshops and classes, eager to see what the bikers had to offer. One evening, as the gang gathered around a bonfire outside the warehouse, Victor stood to address them. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that hadn't been there before. "We've come a long way," he said, his gaze sweeping over the group. "And we've still got a long way to go. But I'm proud of what we've built here. We've shown this town, and ourselves, that we're more than our past." The bikers nodded, their expressions solemn but proud. Mark stepped forward, clapping Victor on the shoulder. "You've done good, Victor," Mark said. "You'll have. Keep it up." Victor nodded, his eyes meeting Mark's. "Thanks to you, we even got the chance." Mark shook his head. "You earned it." As the months passed, the Iron Vultures became a respected part of the community. They organized fundraisers, helped rebuild damaged homes, and even hosted a town barbecue to bring everyone together. The once feared gang was now a symbol of hope and redemption, proving that even the most broken people could find their way back. For Mark, the experience was transformative. He had come into the town as a man searching for purpose, but he had found something far greater, a chance to make a real difference. Watching Victor and the gang grow into leaders and role models reminded him of why he had joined the military in the first place: to protect, to serve, and to inspire. One evening, as Mark prepared to leave the warehouse for the night, Victor stopped him at the door. "You ever think about staying?" Victor asked, his tone casual but hopeful. Mark smiled faintly. "I've thought about it, but there are other places that need help, other people who need a second chance." Victor nodded, though disappointment flickered in his eyes. "Well, if you ever change your mind, there's always a place for you here." "Thanks, Victor," Mark said. "That means a lot." As Mark drove away, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: the Iron Vultures were going to be just fine. The Iron Vultures' transformation was undeniable, but the road to redemption was far from smooth. While many in the town had begun to embrace the gang's new role in the community, others still viewed them with suspicion, waiting for them to slip up. It was during one of these moments of skepticism that the gang faced their greatest challenge yet. One crisp autumn morning, Mark arrived at the warehouse to find Victor pacing outside, his expression dark. Several members of the gang stood nearby, murmuring among themselves. As soon as Victor saw Mark, he waved him over. "What's going on?" Mark asked, his tone calm but concerned. "We've got a problem," Victor replied, running a hand through his hair. "One of the local stores was broken into last night. The owner says they saw someone wearing a leather jacket like ours leaving the scene. Mark's jaw tightened. Do they know who it was? Victor shook his head. No, but that doesn't matter. The town's already pointing fingers at us. They think we're slipping back into old habits? Mark's gaze swept over the gang, his mind racing. Is there any chance it was one of our guys? Victor's voice hardened. No. I've talked to everyone, and they swear they didn't have anything to do with it. We've worked too hard to throw it all away now. Mark nodded, trusting Victor's judgment. All right, then we need to find out who did this and clear your name. How? Victor asked, his frustration evident. Half the town's ready to run us out of here, and the other half won't even talk to us. Mark placed a hand on Victor's shoulder. One step at a time. Let's start with the store owner. Maybe they saw something that can help us. The store owner, a middle-aged man named Mr. Sanders, was initially reluctant to speak with them. When Mark and Victor arrived at his shop, he stood behind the counter with his arms crossed, his expression cold. I don't know why you're here, Sanders said. I've already told the sheriff everything. We're not here to cause trouble, Mark said calmly. We just want to help. If it wasn't one of Victor's guys, then we need to figure out who it was before things get worse. Sanders hesitated, his eyes flicking to Victor. And why should I believe you? Because we've spent the past year trying to make things right, Victor said, his tone steady. I know I've got a lot to make up for, but I'm not about to let someone ruin everything we've worked for. Sanders studied them for a moment before letting out a reluctant sigh. Fine. I didn't get a good look at their face, but they were wearing a black leather jacket with some kind of patch on the back. It looked like a bird or something. Mark and Victor exchanged a glance. The description didn't match the Iron Vulture's insignia, which was a skull with crossed wings. It was a small but important detail. Anything else? Mark asked. Sanders shook his head. That's all I saw before they sped off on a motorcycle. Thank you, Mark said. We'll look into it. Back at the warehouse, Victor called a meeting with the gang to share what they had learned. As he explained the situation, one of the bikers, a wiry man named Logan, spoke up. I think I know who it was, Logan said, his voice hesitant. There's another gang that's been hanging around the outskirts of town. The Black Talons. Their patch is a bird's claw. Victor's expression darkened. The Black Talons? They're bad news. Mark frowned. Do they have a reason to target us? Plenty, Victor said. They've been trying to expand their territory, and they don't like the fact that we've gone legit. Makes them look weak. Mark nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. All right, if they're behind this, we need proof. Do you know where their base is? An old warehouse near the quarry, Logan said. But they're not the kind of guys you just walk up to. Mark's gaze was steady. We're not walking up to them. We're gathering evidence. That night, Mark and Victor drove to the quarry under the cover of darkness. The Black Talons warehouse was lit by a few dim floodlights, and the sound of motorcycles echoed through the night. Mark scanned the area with a pair of binoculars, noting the gang's movements and the layout of the building. We'll need to be careful, Mark said. If they catch us, this could get ugly. Victor smirked. You're starting to sound like me. Mark chuckled softly. I'll take that as a compliment. They waited until the gang's activity died down, then crept closer to the warehouse. Mark's military training came into play as he guided Victor through the shadows, avoiding detection. They found a vantage point overlooking the entrance and watched as one of the Black Talons unloaded a bag of stolen goods from the back of a truck. That's our proof, Mark whispered. We just need to get a picture. Victor nodded, his expression tense but determined. Mark pulled out his phone and snapped several photos, capturing the gang members and the stolen items. Once they had what they needed, they slipped away, retreating to the safety of their truck. The next morning, Mark and Victor met with the sheriff to present their evidence. The sheriff, a stern but fair man named Daniels, examined the photos carefully. This is solid, Daniels said. If we can tie this to the robbery, we can bring them in. What about us? Victor asked. The town still thinks we're behind it. Daniels nodded. I'll make sure they know the truth. You've earned that much. News of the Black Talons' arrest spread quickly, and the townspeople's attitudes toward the Iron Vultures began to shift. For the first time, people started to see them not as criminals but as protectors. members of the community who were willing to stand up for what was right. At the warehouse, Victor gathered the gang to celebrate their victory. The atmosphere was lighter than it had been in weeks, the weight of suspicion finally lifting. "You all did good," Victor said, his voice filled with pride. "We stood our ground, and we proved that we're not the same people we used to be." The bikers cheered, their faces alight with relief and joy. Mark stood off to the side, watching with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Victor caught his eye and walked over, a small smile on his face. "Looks like we finally turned the corner," Victor said. Mark nodded. "You earned it." "Couldn't have done it without you," Victor said, his voice sincere. "You didn't just give us a second chance, you showed us how to take it." Mark smiled faintly. "That's what it's all about." As the gang celebrated late into the night, Mark felt a sense of peace settle over him. The Iron Vultures had faced their greatest test yet, and they had come out stronger on the other side. For the first time, it felt like their redemption was truly within reach.